The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week her husband had been buried, and Delia Hurst had always believed that coincidences like that were the universe pressing its thumb into an old bruise just to remind you it was still there. She stood on the warped wooden porch of the Hurst homestead outside of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, and she read the telegram twice before folding it into her apron pocket. The words were plain enough. The bank in Wichita had called in the note on the property. She had 90 days to pay the outstanding balance of $412, or the land would be seized and sold at auction. $412. She might as well have been asked to reach up and pull down the moon. The homestead sat on 160 acres of short-grass prairie, the kind of land that looked like nothing to a stranger passing through on the cattle trail, but was everything to a woman who had broken her back alongside her husband planting it, tending it, and coaxing life from its stubborn clay soil. Thomas Hurst had filed the claim in 1876, the same year he had married Delia, and for 6 years they had worked it together. Then the fever came in the spring of 1882, the same fever that had swept through 3 neighboring farms and taken 2 children and 1 old widow before it settled into Thomas's chest and would not leave. He was gone inside of 2 weeks. He was 31 years old and Delia was 27, and she had stood at his grave on a cold April morning and had not cried because she had been too stunned to do anything except stare at the raw brown earth and think, with a kind of helpless clarity, that the garden needed watering. She had not cried since. She had not asked anyone for anything since. She had not said the word stay to any living person since the funeral, because the last time she had said it, kneeling beside Thomas's bed with her hands pressed flat against his chest, as though she could hold him in this world by force alone, it had meant nothing. The word had left her mouth and fallen into the air and done absolutely nothing, and Thomas had died anyway, and she had decided somewhere in the marrow of her bones that she was done asking people to remain where she needed them. People left. That was the truth of it, and she was done pretending otherwise. She managed the farm alone through the spring and into the summer. She was not helpless. She knew how to handle the 2 horses, how to manage the small kitchen garden, how to maintain the fences, and how to keep the books. She sold eggs at the general store in Caldwell and took in sewing from the wives of the cattlemen when the drovers came through. She was precise with every penny. She was efficient. She did not allow herself to think very far ahead, because thinking ahead meant imagining a future, and she was not ready for that yet. But $412 was $412, and no amount of eggs or sewing was going to close that gap in 90 days. It was old Clarence Whitfield at the general store who mentioned the ranch. Ford spread out past Chicaskia River, Clarence said, sliding her a paper bag of sugar across the counter while she counted coins with brisk, practiced fingers. They're hiring. Harvey Ford runs the operation since his daddy passed. Good outfit from what I hear. Not one of them big cattle kings, but solid. They say he's been advertising for a cook and a housekeeper, on account of his men been complaining about eating trail beans for 6 months running. Delia looked up. I am not a housekeeper. No, Clarence agreed cheerfully, but you are a woman who needs money, and Harvey Ford is a man who needs someone to run his house. Sometimes life has a sense of humor. She did not respond to that. She finished counting her coins, tucked the sugar under her arm, and walked back across the dusty Main Street to her wagon. She sat on the buckboard for a long moment with the reins loose in her hands, watching a pair of longhorns being driven through the far end of town by a boy who looked about 15 years old and entirely too proud of himself. The sky above the Kansas plains was enormous and cloudless and indifferent. She drove home, fed the horses, checked the fences, cooked a supper she barely tasted, and then sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and read the telegram one more time. The next morning she put on her best dress, hitched the wagon, and drove out toward the Chicaskia River. The Ford ranch came into view gradually, the way good things often did out here, starting as a low, dark line against the horizon that slowly resolved itself into fences and outbuildings, and finally into the main house, which was bigger than she had expected. Not grand, not the sort of place a cattle baron would build to show off his wealth, but well-constructed and solidly maintained, with a wide covered porch and a kitchen garden alongside the east wall that was, she noted with a small flicker of professional interest, considerably overgrown. A man was working at the corral fence when she pulled up, his back to her, his shirt dark with sweat despite the morning hour. He was maybe 29 or 30, she guessed, with the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than any particular intention about it, broad through the shoulders and lean through the middle, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar. He was replacing a fence rail, doing it with the focused attention of someone who believed that whatever was in front of him at any given moment deserved to be done properly. He turned when he heard the wagon, and she got her first look at Harvey Ford's face. It was a plain face, she decided immediately, by which she meant honest. Dark eyes that were direct without being aggressive, a jaw that could have been carved from the same limestone as the creek beds around here, and a mouth that looked like it was deciding whether or not to smile and had not quite made up its mind yet. He was not what you would call a handsome man in the way that the word got used in novels. He was something more durable than that. "Morning," he said, squinting up at her against the sun. "Morning," she said. "I am looking for Harvey Ford. You found him. I heard you are looking for a cook and housekeeper." He looked at her steadily. Not rudely, but with the frank assessment of a man who had learned that out here, a person's appearance could tell you useful things if you paid attention. She let him look. She had nothing to hide from a straightforward gaze. "I am," he said. "You have experience." "I have been keeping a household and growing my own food for 6 years," she said. "I am a good cook, I keep clean books, I do not mind hard work, and I do not make complaints about it." "You have a name." "Delia Hurst." "My husband filed the Hurst claim south of town. He passed in April." Something shifted in his face at that. Not pity exactly, more like recognition, the way one person who has lost something will sometimes acknowledge another. "I am sorry," he said, and she could tell he meant it rather than just saying it. "I need the position," she said directly, because there was no point in circling around it. "I will do good work. I will not be any trouble." Harvey Ford wiped his hands on his work trousers and looked past her toward the main house for a moment, as though he was thinking something through. Then he looked back at her. $3 a week," he said. "You would have the small room off the kitchen, meals included. I have 6 ranch hands to feed 3 times a day plus whatever I need for the house itself. $3 a week would not save the farm in 90 days. She did the calculation almost instantly, the way she was always doing calculations now, the way she did them in her sleep. $3, 13 weeks, $39, not even close. "That is acceptable," she said anyway, because $39 was still $39, and because standing still was not going to save anything either. She moved in the following day. The Ford ranch house had the look of a place that had been well tended once and had since been left to the mercy of people who were not interested in tending. The main room was clean enough but cold in the way that rooms get when they are only used for functional purposes and never for sitting in. The kitchen was serviceable but chaotic, with supplies stored without any system, a stove that needed blacking, and a pantry that was a testament to the purchasing habits of men who bought things in bulk when they remembered, and then forgot they had bought them. She found 4 separate tins of lard and no baking powder. She found an enormous quantity of dried beans and no cornmeal. She made a list. She organized the pantry. She set the kitchen to rights in a single afternoon with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who understood that a well-run kitchen was its own kind of dignity. Harvey Ford came in at the end of that first day, while she was finishing supper, a simple thing of roasted salt pork and potatoes and fresh bread that she had managed despite the limited pantry, and he stopped in the doorway and stood there for a moment taking in the ordered kitchen with an expression that she could not quite read. "You did not have to do all of this today," he said. "It needed doing," she said, without turning from the stove. "The bread smells good. Sit down if you are going to eat." The 6 ranch hands came in noisily, boots heavy on the floorboards, filling the long table with their elbows and their talk, and Delia served the meal with the brisk competence of someone who had been cooking for hungry men her entire adult life. They ate with the focused gratitude of people who had been surviving on their own terrible cooking for months, and old Pete Garvey, who was the oldest of the hands at about 55 and apparently had designated himself the group's spokesman, said reverently that this was the first real bread he had eaten since Christmas, and could she please never leave. She did not respond to that. She kept moving, filling cups, clearing plates, maintaining the steady rhythm of service that required no thought and therefore left no room for feeling. That night in the small room off the kitchen, she sat on the narrow bed and looked at the wall and did her arithmetic again. She had 90 days, approximately, from the receipt of the telegram. She had already used one of them. She needed $412. She had $3 a week coming in. She needed a plan that was considerably more ambitious than a housekeeper's wage. She fell asleep still thinking about it, which was better than the alternative, which was thinking about Thomas. The days settled into a rhythm. She rose before the sun, had the coffee on and the breakfast started before the hands came in, kept the house through the morning, managed the kitchen garden in the afternoons, and had supper on the table by the time the men came in from the range. She was not unhappy. That was the clearest way she could put it to herself. She was not unhappy in the particular way that a person who has gone numb is not unhappy, which is different from the way a person who has found peace is not unhappy, but it served the purpose for now. Harvey Ford was a different kind of employer than she had expected. He was not distant, the way some men were with household help, treating the person who cooked their food and cleaned their rooms as a kind of useful furniture. But neither was he familiar in any way that made her uncomfortable. He was simply present, in the way that a solid, decent person is present, paying attention to the work of the ranch with the same care he apparently paid to everything else. She noticed things about him without meaning to. The way he listened to Pete Garvey's long-winded opinions on cattle breeding with genuine patience. The way he checked on the horses each evening before coming in to supper, not because anyone required it of him, but because he wanted to. The way he left a book open on the kitchen table sometimes, and how, when she moved it to clean, she noticed he was reading history and not the adventure stories that most of the men around here favored. She also noticed that he was clearly making an effort not to impose on her. He left the kitchen when she was working in it unless he had a specific need. He thanked her for meals with a directness that meant more than the elaborate compliments that some men offered. He fixed a broken window latch in her room without being asked, leaving no comment about having done it, so that she only noticed when she closed the window that night, and it caught properly for the first time. On the 8th day, she found him in the kitchen garden in the early morning, pulling weeds from around her tomato plants with his hands, working with the same careful attention he gave everything. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him for a moment. "You do not have to do that," she said. He looked up and did not seem embarrassed to have been caught at it. "I know," he said. "Garden was mine before you came. I got behind on it. I can manage the garden. I know that too." He looked at the plants for a moment. "My mother planted these same kind of tomatoes. I like to keep them up." She did not know what to do with that piece of information, so she went back inside and put the coffee on, and did not think about the fact that it had made something behind her sternum feel briefly less like calcified stone. On the 11th day, she made a decision. She had been thinking about the problem methodically, the way she thought about all problems, turning it over and examining it from every angle the way you would examine a rock to find its seams. The ranch sold cattle, and that was the primary income. But there was land sitting unused east of the main pasture, good bottomland along the creek, and she had noticed that the ranch bought its cornmeal and its flour from the general store in Caldwell, at prices that suggested nobody had thought about the economics of growing their own grain. That evening after supper, when the hands had gone out to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, she sat down at the kitchen table with the ranch account ledger, which Harvey had given her access to for the purpose of managing household expenses, and she worked out a proposal. When Harvey came through the kitchen for his evening coffee, she said, without looking up from the ledger, "I have a business proposition for you." He stopped and looked at the ledger and then at her. He pulled out the chair across the table and sat down. "Go ahead," he said. She laid it out precisely. The bottomland east of the pasture could support a grain crop, corn most practically. The cost of seed and labor would be offset within 2 seasons by the savings on purchased grain and the potential sale of surplus. She had calculated the soil quality, the water access, and the growing season. She had done similar work on the Hurst claim. She showed him the numbers. He looked at the numbers for a long time. He was the kind of man who looked at something properly before he responded to it, and she appreciated that even while it tested her patience slightly. "Where did you learn to figure like this?" he said. "My father was an accountant in Missouri," she said, "before we came west." "This is sound," he said, tapping the ledger page. "The margin on the corn is conservative, maybe too conservative if this summer stays dry." "I used the drier estimates deliberately," she said. "Better to be surprised by profit than by loss." He looked at her then, not at the ledger but at her directly, and there was something in the look that she would have described, if she were being honest with herself, as a kind of wondering, like he had not expected her. "All right," he said. "I will put 2 of the men on the bottomland next week. You want to oversee it?" "Yes," she said. "Then oversee it." He paused. "Is there something you need from this, above the wage?" She had prepared for this question, and she answered it directly. "I have a mortgage note coming due on my husband's claim. The bank is going to seize it if I cannot meet the balance. I need to send money to the bank in Wichita before the end of September. I am telling you this so you understand why I am interested in the prosperity of this ranch." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much is the note?" $412. He was still for a little longer. She watched him turn that number over in the same methodical way he turned everything over. "That is a lot of money on a housekeeper's wage," he said, not unkindly. "I am aware," she said, "but I will not take charity. I wanted you to know why I am working as hard as I am." He looked at her steadily. "I never thought you were working hard for any reason other than that it's your nature," he said. Then he got up, took his coffee, and went out onto the porch, leaving her with the ledger and the lamp and the arithmetic. She sat with it for a while. She was not sure what to do with a person who saw her that plainly. It had been a long time since anyone had. The corn planting happened the following week. She was out at the bottomland every morning, directing Pete Garvey and a young hand named Carson with the efficiency of someone who had planted corn before and knew exactly what she was doing. Harvey came out the second morning and walked the rows with her, asking questions that were sensible ones, and she answered them. And they talked about soil and drainage and the behavior of this particular creek in high water. And it was an ordinary professional conversation in every way except that she noticed somewhere in the middle of it that she had been talking to him for 45 minutes without once having to manage the quality of the conversation, which was unusual. Most people required management. They required careful steerage, gentle redirection away from topics that were too raw, patient deflection of the well-meaning questions about Thomas, about her plans, about whether she was lonely. Harvey Ford did not ask any of those questions. He talked about the land, and when there was nothing useful left to say about the land, he was comfortable with the silence between them, which was, she had found, an extraordinarily rare quality in a person. In the evenings after supper, he sometimes sat on the porch, and sometimes she sat there too, not quite together but not quite separate either. They looked at the same prairie and the same enormous sky and did not make demands of each other. On a Tuesday evening 3 weeks into her time at the Ford Ranch, with the corn seedlings an inch out of the ground and the tomatoes beginning to set fruit, Pete Garvey came back from Caldwell with a letter for Delia. It was from the bank in Wichita, a follow-up to the telegram, more formal and more threatening, clarifying that the note would be called at auction on the 1st of October if not redeemed. She read it in the kitchen, standing, and then put it in her apron pocket and went on with preparing supper. Her hands were steady. Her face was composed. She had known this was coming. She was still short by approximately $350 and she had 63 days. That night she did not go out to the porch. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and her sewing and the numbers she had been running in her head for weeks, and she was so deep in the arithmetic of it that she did not hear Harvey come back inside until he was standing in the kitchen doorway. "Bad news," he said quietly. She looked up. "The bank," she said. "A formal letter. The date is confirmed." He came in and sat down across from her. He did not ask if she wanted to talk about it. He simply sat there, which was somehow both less and more than talking. After a moment he said, "I want to offer you something and I want you to hear it as a business proposition, not as charity, because I know the difference matters to you." She waited. "The claim south of town," he said. "I have been thinking about it since you told me the situation. That land has good access to the cattle trail. I have been thinking about expanding the operation east, and access land along the trail has value to me that has nothing to do with sentiment. I would like to purchase the mortgage note from the bank in Wichita. You would pay me back at no interest over whatever time makes sense, from your wage and from a share of any profit from the corn operation and anything else you turn your hand to here." She stared at him. "I would not own your claim," he said carefully. "You would. I would own the note, and we would have an agreement in writing that the terms are repayment at your pace with no penalty and no interest. If the land gains value because of the trail access, that benefit is yours when the note is paid. I am not trying to take your land, Delia. I am trying to keep someone from taking it from you." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass with its low, constant whisper. She had not cried since Thomas's funeral. She had not come close, but something in her chest now was doing something extremely inconvenient that she dealt with by pressing her hands flat on the table and breathing with great deliberateness. "Why?" she said, and her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. He looked at her with that direct, dark gaze. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. "And because you are the best worker I have had on this ranch, and I would like you to stay." The word landed on her like a hand pressed gently against her sternum. Stay. She had not said the word stay to any living person since the funeral. She had said it to Thomas at the last when it had done no good. She had decided after that she would not say it again to anyone. You could not make people stay. You could not hold them here with words. You simply managed alone, and that was the honest accounting of the way the world worked. And yet, "I will accept the terms," she said. "I want the agreement in writing with both signatures." "Of course," he said. He extended his hand across the table in the straightforward way of a man making a business deal. She shook it. His hand was rough and warm, and she let go of it a fraction of a second later than was strictly necessary, and neither of them mentioned it. The agreement was written up the following day with the help of the notary in Caldwell, and Harvey Ford rode to Wichita the day after that and redeemed the note. He came back in the evening with the paper in hand, and placed it on the kitchen table in front of her without ceremony, and she picked it up and read every word of it twice with her reading glasses on and her lips moving slightly. And then she folded it carefully and put it in the small locked box she kept under her bed. She went back to the kitchen and made the best supper she had made since she arrived, a proper roast with carrots and onions from the garden, and fresh apple pie from the small apple tree she had found half wild at the edge of the yard and coaxed back into bearing. And when everyone sat down, Harvey looked at the table and then at her and said, with that slight quality of private communication that had been developing between them, "You did not have to." "I know," she said, which was the same thing he had said to her about the garden, and something in the repetition of it made the faint lines at the corner of his eyes shift in a way she was beginning to understand was his version of a smile. Old Pete noticed. He was 70% deaf and entirely too observant for anyone's comfort, and he watched the exchange with the satisfied expression of a man watching something he had predicted come true. She gave him a look that she hoped communicated that he should keep his observations to himself. He communicated back with his eyebrows that he absolutely would not. The summer deepened. The corn came up strong in the bottomland, thick green rows of it, that she walked every few days with the same proprietary pleasure she had always taken in growing things. The kitchen garden flourished under her attention in a way it clearly had not for years, giving back tomatoes and green beans and summer squash in quantities that kept her busy putting things up for the winter in addition to everything else. She was tired in a way that was physical and clean, the tiredness of a body that had worked hard and done something useful, which was entirely different from the tiredness she had carried since April, the exhaustion of grief, which had no remedy except time. The men on the ranch had adopted her, she realized somewhere around the 6th week, in the way that lonely, hard-working men will adopt a woman who feeds them well and treats them like people rather than furniture. Pete Garvey was the most obvious about it, checking in on her with the slightly aggressive protectiveness of an older brother. And young Carson had begun bringing her wildflowers with the transparent hope and utter lack of guile of a 19-year-old who did not yet know how to hide his feelings. She was gentle with him about it. She liked him the way you like a puppy. She was very clear, in a kind way, that there was nothing but professional friendliness available from her end, and he was young enough that it bounced off him without doing too much damage. Harvey saw the interaction with Carson one afternoon when she was explaining for the second time, with patient firmness, that she appreciated the bluebells but she preferred to be left to her work. Harvey waited until Carson had retreated to the bunkhouse and then said from the corral gate, without looking away from the horse he was working, "He's a good kid." "He is," she agreed. "He will also get over it inside of a week." Harvey said nothing for a moment, continuing to move around the horse with the quiet, deliberate ease of someone who understood the language of animals. Then he said, "You are not unkind about it." "He is 19 years old," she said. "There is no version of unkindness that serves a 19-year-old except the direct kind, which I gave him." Harvey nodded slowly. He did not say anything else, but she had the impression he had filed whatever she had said somewhere useful. On the 1st of August, the river flooded. It came up 3 feet in a night, the Chicaskia running brown and fast and merciless after a week of rain on the plains to the north, and by morning the bottomland where the corn was growing was under 2 feet of moving water. Delia was out at dawn in her rubber boots walking the high bank and looking at the drowned field with a cold, practical grief that had nothing to do with the larger grief she carried and everything to do with the smaller, immediate kind. Harvey stood beside her. He said nothing for a long time. "The root systems are developed enough that if the water recedes in the next 2 days, we save most of it," she said. She had been calculating already because that was what she did. The outer rows closest to the creek bank are likely gone. The rest will depend on how fast the water moves. "It will recede," he said. "The channel here cuts back to normal fast. This happens most summers." She looked at him. "You might have mentioned that before we planted." "I should have," he said, and he actually sounded sorry about it. "I should have told you the flood risk on this particular piece of land. I assumed you knew, which was my mistake." She appreciated that he did not try to explain it away. "How fast does it recede?" 36 hours if no more rain comes." She looked at the sky, clear to the north. "Then we watch it," she said, "and we prepare to replant the outer rows if we need to." They watched it. The water dropped as he had predicted, and 36 hours after the peak the outer rows were exposed again, and the damage was exactly what she had estimated, the eastern quarter of the field gone, the rest battered but alive. She and Harvey and Pete and Carson spent a full day staking up bent stalks and replanting what had been lost, and by the evening of the 2nd day after the flood, the field looked damaged but not defeated. She was muddy from the waist down and tired to the bone when they finished, and she walked back to the house in the golden late afternoon light with her boots leaving clay prints on the path. Harvey was walking beside her, equally muddy, equally tired, and she was aware of the comfortable nearness of him in a way that she had been becoming increasingly aware of for weeks without allowing herself to give it a name. "You did not panic," he said. "Panic does not drain fields," she said. "No," he agreed. "But some people do it anyway." She thought about that. "When Thomas died," she said, because she found herself saying it before she had decided to, "the doctor told me there was nothing to be done, that the fever had taken too strong a hold. He said it the way people say things they believe are helpful. And I thought, all right, then we manage what we can manage. So I kept the house. I managed the claim. I got through the planting season." She paused. "I have found that panic is mostly a way of making yourself the center of a difficulty that is larger than you." Harvey was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My father died 2 years ago, Hart. I found him in the north pasture. I stood there for a long time before I did anything, not because I was panicking, but because I could not quite figure out how the world had continued to look exactly the same." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and they stood on the path between the bottomland and the house in the long evening light, and she looked at him and felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, which was the specific sensation of being understood by another person. "Yes," she said softly. "That is exactly it." He nodded. He did not say anything more about it. They walked back to the house together in the comfortable silence that had become one of her private measures of the time at the Ford ranch, a silence that was not absence but presence, not emptiness but ease. That night she sat in the kitchen long after everyone had gone to bed, and she thought very carefully about what she was allowing to happen in her own heart and whether she was making a terrible mistake. She had come here for money. She had come here with a specific and practical purpose: to earn enough to save the Hurst claim, to keep the land that she and Thomas had built together, to preserve the concrete evidence of the life they had made. She had not come here to develop feelings for a man she worked for. She had not come here to be anything other than a person doing a job efficiently and then leaving. Except that he had purchased her mortgage note and asked for nothing except repayment at her own pace. Except that he tended his mother's tomatoes with his own hands in the early morning. Except that he read history and listened to Pete Garvey's opinions on cattle breeding, and knew how the Chicaskia River behaved in August, and stood still in a field after loss to understand what the world had done. Except that he saw her, which was the most dangerous thing of all, which was the thing she had least expected and most needed, and which she did not know what to do with. She was 27 years old. She was a widow. She had work to do and a debt to pay and a farm of her own to think about. She was not going to be foolish about this. She went to bed and was foolish about it anyway, in the quiet, unguarded territory of almost sleep, where you cannot maintain your practical armor and something warm and persistent moved through her chest and would not be entirely shut out. The corn came in at the end of August, and it was a strong yield, better than her conservative estimate. She stood in the field with the harvest figures and showed them to Harvey and said, "I owe you a payment against the note," and named the amount, and he wrote it down in the ledger without comment except to say the math was right, which was not really a compliment coming from him, more an acknowledgement of fact, which was somehow better than a compliment. The range was busy in September with the last of the cattle drives, the herds of longhorns coming up the Kisham Trail and through Caldwell on their way to the railhead, and the ranch was loud with the work of it, the men extended, Harvey riding out before dawn and not back until after dark. She kept the house, kept the men fed, kept the records, and found herself measuring the day by his return in a way that she found extremely inconvenient to admit. One evening in the second week of September, he came in late and sat down at the kitchen table, and she put a plate in front of him that she had kept warm, and he looked at it and then at her, and he said, "You waited up." "I was finishing the books," she said, which was true. "You could have left the plate on the stove." "It would have dried out," she said, which was also true. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. Delia, he said, just her name, nothing else. But the way he said it had a quality she had not heard in her name in a long time, and she sat down across from him, because her legs had made that decision independently of her intentions. "There is something I want to ask you," he said, "and I want to be clear that it has nothing to do with the note or the work or anything that puts you in a position where you feel obligated. I am aware of how the lines are drawn here. I am aware that I am your employer, and that makes certain things complicated. I want you to know that whatever you say makes no difference to anything practical. Your position here, your wage, the note, none of it." She waited. He took a breath, which was the most uncertainty she had ever seen him display. "I would very much like to take you to supper in Caldwell on Saturday evening," he said, "not as your employer, as a man who has been thinking about you for 2 months and has finally decided that saying nothing is the less honest choice." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a night bird called twice and fell silent. She sat with it. She held it carefully, like something that might shatter. "I have been thinking about you too," she said. Her voice came out steady, which she appreciated. "I am not entirely sure what to do about it." "Supper might be a start," he said, and the lines at the corner of his eyes shifted in that way she had come to know. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed, and went back to eating, and she went back to the ledger, and the kitchen settled back into its quiet, and the lamp burned warm, and she thought with a kind of helpless clarity that the world had done something unexpected. Saturday came, and she put on the blue dress that she had not worn since before Thomas died, because it had always been the dress she wore when she wanted to feel like a person rather than a function. And she pinned her hair up with the tortoiseshell pins her mother had given her. And she sat on the edge of her bed for a moment and said, quietly, to no one, "Thomas, I hope you understand." The room was silent, which she chose to interpret as permission. Harvey came to the kitchen door at 5 o'clock, which was the appointed time, wearing a clean white shirt and his good hat, and an expression of deliberate composure that she recognized as the same effort she was making. He looked at her, and the deliberate composure did something complicated for a moment. "You look fine," he said, which in the language he used was the most straightforward possible form of admiration. "So do you," she said, which was accurate. They drove into Caldwell in the wagon, which was not the most romantic vehicle, but the evening light was warm and golden across the prairie, and the air smelled of late summer grass and distance. And she sat beside him on the buckboard and was aware of the warmth of him next to her, and thought that this was the first time she had been fully present in an evening, truly in it rather than managing through it, since before April. He took her to the hotel dining room, which was Caldwell's best approximation of elegance, white tablecloths and candles, and a menu that featured options beyond beans and beef. They ordered the chicken, which was the sensible choice, and Harvey ordered a bottle of wine, which surprised her, and when it came he poured it with the slight awkwardness of a man who did not pour wine very often but intended to do it correctly. They talked. They talked the way they had been talking for 2 months, with the ease of people who have discovered they think at similar speeds and care about similar things, but they talked now without the professional frame around it, and it was different. She told him about Missouri, about her father's accounting office where she had done the books from the age of 14, about the way she had come west with Thomas and had loved the openness of it from the first moment she saw the Kansas sky. He told her about his father building the ranch from nothing, about learning cattle from Pete Garvey when he was 11 years old, about the 2 years since his father died when the weight of the operation had sat on him with a particular loneliness that the work helped but did not cure. "Your wife," she said carefully, because she had wondered and thought it was better to ask directly than to wonder indefinitely. "There was never a wife." "There was almost a wife," he said. "In 1879. She decided Kansas was not what she wanted, and she was honest about it before the wedding rather than after. I hold no ill feeling about it. But it was hard," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "It was hard." She looked at the candle on the table between them and thought about the small economies of loss, the way people carried things quietly and got on with it and were stronger for the carrying and lonelier at the same time. "I do not want you to think I am looking for someone to replace Thomas," she said. "That is not what this is." "I know that," he said. "I would not want to be anyone's replacement. I want to be someone's." He paused, considering the word carefully in the way he considered things. "Someone's next thing." She looked at him. "Next thing," she repeated. "The thing that comes after," he said. "Not instead of, after." She thought that was possibly the most emotionally intelligent thing she had heard from another person since Thomas died, and Thomas had been a man of considerable emotional intelligence, which meant she was comparing Harvey Ford to a very high standard and he was meeting it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, where it rested beside his wine glass. He turned his hand over and his fingers closed around hers, and she sat with that for a moment, the warmth of it, the simplicity of it. "Next thing," she said softly. "All right." He drove her back in the dark, the prairie around them enormous and star-crowded and silent, except for the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon and the insects. And when they reached the ranch house, he helped her down from the buckboard, his hands at her waist, and she stood for a moment in the circle of the almost contact, and looked up at him in the starlight. He kissed her once, gently, with the carefulness of a man who understands that some things are important and ought to be treated that way. She kissed him back, with the directness of a woman who had decided and did not do things halfway. She went inside and stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment, one hand pressed to her mouth, feeling something in her chest that was terrifying and warm and new. October came. She made the first payment against the mortgage note from the corn profits and her wages combined, and she sat down with Harvey at the kitchen table, and they went over the numbers together, which had become the way they worked, side by side over the ranch accounts, their heads closed together over the same page. She had extended the bookkeeping of the operation considerably since she arrived, and the ranch's accounts were in better shape than they had been in years. Harvey was honest about this. "You have made this operation considerably more efficient," he said, "and I want you to know I am aware of it." "The corn was a good first step," she said. "Next spring I think we should consider winter wheat in the North Field. The rail access to Wichita has improved and the wheat market is strong." He looked at her. "You are already planning next spring," he said. "Is that presumptuous?" she said. He looked at her in a way that made the answer clear without saying it. "Plan whatever you like," he said. That was in the first week of October, and by the third week of October, the situation between them was known to everyone on the ranch with the exception of no one, because Pete Garvey had the observational capacity of a man half his age and the discretion of a very cheerful house cat. He made no comments directly, but his expression at the supper table when Harvey passed the biscuits to Delia first, and then caught himself, had the quality of private vindication that is uniquely satisfying in old men. Young Carson had moved on from his earlier feelings with the agility of youth, and had developed an interest in the miller's daughter in Caldwell, and he reported on this development to anyone who would listen with touching enthusiasm. Delia was genuinely pleased for him. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, Harvey saddled 2 horses and took her out to see the Hurst claim. She had not been back since she had left to come to the ranch, and she sat on the horse at the edge of her own property line and looked at the small house and the fences and the Winterbear garden, with the peculiar double vision of someone looking at both a real place and a place that exists simultaneously in memory. "Do you want to go in?" Harvey said. "Yes," she said. They rode in. The house was intact, undisturbed, exactly as she had left it. She walked through it slowly, room by room, touching things. Thomas's hat on its hook by the door, which she had not been able to bring herself to take down when she left. The quilt her mother had made on the bed. The kitchen where she had spent so many hours of her life. It was all there, perfectly preserved, a small museum of a particular time. Harvey waited in the main room while she went through. He did not follow her into the bedroom. He understood, without being told, where the line was. She came back out and stood in the main room and looked at Thomas's hat for a long time, "I am going to keep it," she said. "The claim, I want to keep the land." "Of course," Harvey said. "I could rent it," she said. "There are new homesteaders coming through. Someone could work the fields. The income would help pay down the note faster. We can find a good tenant," he said. "Someone who will take care of it." She took the hat off the hook. She held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. Then she put it carefully in the cloth bag she had brought and tied the bag closed. She was done here for today. She would come back. It would always be part of what she carried. But it did not have to be where she lived. They rode back in the late afternoon, and the sunset was one of those Kansas sunsets that are almost theatrical in their excess, the whole western sky going gold and crimson and orange. And she rode beside Harvey through the autumn-brown grass and felt, with a care she gave the feeling, that she was not betraying Thomas by being here. She was simply continuing, which was what the living were obligated to do. "Harvey," she said. "Yes, I think I want to stay." The words came out of her mouth with the simplicity of the most natural thing she had ever said. And then she heard them, truly heard them, and something stopped in her chest. She had not said the word stay to any living person since the funeral. She had said it to Thomas, at the last, pressed against him with both hands, and it had meant nothing, and she had decided after that she was done saying it. She had kept that decision for 6 months, through grief and work and the slow recovery of herself from the bottom of a very deep well. She had built around herself a careful structure that did not include asking people to remain, because the word was a wound, and she had not trusted herself to use it without bleeding. And then she had said it to Harvey Ford, riding home through a Kansas sunset, and she could not take it back. It was out there in the air between them, plain and unretractable. He looked at her. He had heard it. He understood it, not just the practical meaning, the intention to remain at the ranch, but the other meaning, the one underneath, the one that cost something. He did not make a production of it. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said quietly, "I would like that very much." She exhaled. She had not realized she had been holding her breath. "I cannot promise I am easy," she said. "I have a great deal of practicality and not very much softness left at the moment." "I do not need softness," he said. "I need exactly what you are." She looked at the sunset and then back at him, and something in her chest, in that calcified place behind her sternum, shifted in a way that was slightly painful and entirely necessary, the way that something locked for a long time feels when it is finally opened. "All right," she said. "I am staying." November brought cold and the ranch settling into its winter work, the slower pace of the off-season that was nevertheless full of maintenance and preparation, and the endless tasks that a ranch required to stay a ranch. She had been at the Ford spread for almost 5 months, and the house was, by any honest accounting, hers in all practical ways. The kitchen was hers. The kitchen garden, now put to bed under mulch for the winter, was hers. The accounts were hers. The pantry that was now organized with a logic that any of the hands could navigate was hers. Harvey asked her to marry him on a Thursday evening in November, which was not a romantic day of the week, but she had always found romance in a person's character rather than in the decoration around it, and Harvey Ford's character was one of the most solid things she had ever encountered. He did it at the kitchen table, which was where most of the serious business of their lives had happened, with no particular ceremony except that he had waited until the hands were all in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet. He sat across from her and said, "I want to ask you something that I should ask you properly." She set down her mending and gave him her attention. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "because I love you and because I want to make a life with you, and I want to be clear that those are the only reasons, and there is no business consideration attached to it. The note stands on its own terms regardless of what you say right now. You could say no, and nothing changes between us except that I will be disappointed, and I will get over it." She looked at him. She thought about all the calculations she had made since April, all the arithmetic of survival, all the careful management of her own heart that she had undertaken to keep it from being of any further use to anyone who might take it with them when they left. She thought about what he had said, that first night when they talked about it seriously. about being someone's next thing. The thing that comes after, not instead of, after. Yes, she said. His face did something she had not quite seen it do before. It broke open a little, in the best possible way, the way a door breaks open onto light. They were married in January of 1883 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, on a day when the sky was ice blue and cloudless, and the temperature required everyone to keep their coats on through the ceremony, which the Reverend managed with cheerful pragmatism and Pete Garvey managed with his best hat, and a broad satisfaction that he made absolutely no effort to conceal. Carson stood up with Harvey, and the miller's daughter sat in the front pew with an expression of deep romantic approval. There were approximately 30 people in the church, the combination of ranch people and Caldwell townspeople, and a handful of neighboring farmers who had known Delia in the years of the Hurst claim. She wore the blue dress again, with her mother's tortoiseshell pins in her hair, and she stood beside Harvey Ford before the Reverend, and said the words with the same directness she brought to everything, meaning every syllable. He said them back to her with the steady, honest quality that was entirely his own, looking at her the whole time. When the Reverend pronounced them married and Harvey kissed her in front of 30 people, and the January light coming cold and bright through the church windows, she thought that the world was capable of surprising her after all, which she had not entirely believed 6 months ago. The wedding supper was at the hotel, and Pete Garvey made a toast that was entirely too long and extremely specific about the corn crop and the bottomland, which Delia found privately hilarious, and Harvey received with the tolerant affection of a man who had known Pete Garvey since he was 11 years old. Carson made a toast that was short and sincere and lovely, and the miller's daughter held his hand during it, and he went red in a way that made the whole table fond of him. Winter gave way to spring, and the wheat went into the north field as planned, and the bottomland corn was planted again, this time with a proper accounting of the flood behavior of the Chicaskia and a deliberate adjustment of the row layout to put the most vulnerable plants back from the eastern bank. The kitchen garden expanded by a third because Delia had ideas for it that she had been developing since the previous summer, and Harvey built her a second cold frame without being asked because he had been watching her work and understood what she needed before she got around to requesting it. She paid down the Hearst note through the spring and summer, making regular payments from the ranch income that she now managed jointly with Harvey, and she found a tenant for the Hearst claim in the form of a young couple from Ohio named the Brennans, recent arrivals, earnest and hardworking, who paid a fair rent and wrote her letters about the state of the kitchen garden that she found she enjoyed receiving. The land was being worked. It was alive. Thomas had always said the land deserved to be worked, and she was honoring that. In June, she told Harvey she was expecting. They were in the kitchen garden in the early morning, her usual time for it, and she had been trying to find a practical moment for several days and had finally decided that a practical moment was not coming and she should simply say it. She was weeding the tomatoes, his mother's tomatoes, and she straightened up and said it plainly. He stood very still for a moment. She watched him. Then he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said. "Better than fine. It is early still, but everything is as it should be." He crossed the garden in 2 steps and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that was entirely open in a way that Harvey Ford's expressions rarely were, unguarded and full, and something that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Delia," he said, and again it was just her name, but she had been learning the grammar of how he used her name, and this one meant everything. The baby was born in January, the first anniversary of their wedding almost to the week, which she appreciated for its symmetry. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with dark hair like his father and the stubborn set of jaw that Harvey said looked like her, and she said looked like him, and they agreed to attribute to the baby himself. They named him Thomas Harvey Ford, with Harvey's agreement and encouragement, because he understood without having to have it explained that Thomas Hurst had been a person who deserved to be remembered. Pete Garvey, when presented with this information, sat down in the kitchen and was quiet for a full minute, and then said, with the slightly rough voice of a man who was not going to cry about it, "That's a good name," and drank his coffee with great dignity. Young Carson, who had married the miller's daughter the previous autumn and was expecting his own child in the spring, said it was the best name he had heard and shook Harvey's hand with enthusiasm. The baby was everything that a first baby is, demanding and astonishing and impossible and precious, and Delia managed the newness of it with her characteristic practicality and her increasing capacity for being surprised by her own heart. She had thought, somewhere in the worst months after Thomas died, that she was done being surprised. She had thought the world had shown her its hand, and it was the kind of hand that took things and did not give them back. She had been wrong, which she was entirely willing to acknowledge. Harvey was extraordinary with the baby. This was perhaps the thing she was least prepared for, although she should have expected it, given what she knew of him. He held the boy with the careful confidence of a man who understood that small things deserved to be treated seriously, and he sat with him in the evenings when the baby was restless and talked to him in the low, steady voice he used with the horses, and the baby settled in a way that seemed almost unfair when Delia had been walking the kitchen floor with him for 20 minutes. "How do you do that?" she asked one evening, watching Harvey settle the baby against his chest with the same ease with which he had always done everything physical. "I just stay still," he said. "He can tell when you're tense." "I am not tense," she said. He looked at her over the baby's head with the slight smile that she had come to love unreasonably. "You are always a little bit tense," he said. "It is one of the things I like about you. You are always thinking." "That is not a compliment," she said. "Yes, it is," he said. She sat down beside him on the settee that she had moved from the main room into the kitchen, because she had decided she spent more time in the kitchen than anywhere, and it ought to be comfortable. And she leaned against his shoulder and looked at their son sleeping against his father's chest. And she thought about the telegram that had arrived on a Tuesday in June of last year, and the drive to the Ford ranch, and the first sight of Harvey at the corral fence with his back to her. She thought about all the small, precise moments that had assembled themselves into this one, this kitchen, this settee, this man, this baby. She thought about the words she had said without thinking on a late afternoon in October, riding home through a Kansas sunset, and how it had gone out of her mouth before she could stop it, and how it had been the truest thing she had said in years. Stay. She had said it to Thomas at the last, and it had broken her. She had decided she would never say it again, and then she had said it to Harvey Ford and found out that there is a difference between asking someone to stay when they are leaving and saying it when you mean it differently. When you mean, "I am the one who is staying. I am choosing to be here. I want to be here. This is where I am." She had said it and could not take it back and had not wanted to, not for a single moment after. The Hurst note was paid in full in the autumn of 1884, 18 months after the marriage. Harvey placed the paid deed on the kitchen table in front of her, and she picked it up and read it and felt the weight of it, the simple, solid fact of it, and then she set it down and looked at him. "I have been thinking about the Brennans," she said. "What about them? They have been good tenants. They love that land. I would like to sell it to them at a fair price, with a reasonable note they can manage on what that claim produces." Harvey looked at her carefully. "That is your land," he said. "That is Thomas's land. Thomas's land is right here," she said quietly. "This is the land I am going to grow old on. That claim belongs to people who will work it the way it deserves to be worked, and the Brennans are those people." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you certain?" "I am always certain when I have made a real decision," she said. "This is a real decision." The Brennans received the offer in October of 1884 and accepted it with a letter that contained more gratitude than Delia was entirely comfortable with. But she had learned to receive gratitude more gracefully than she used to, because Harvey had pointed out to her gently that refusing gratitude was a form of withholding something from the person giving it, and she had thought about that and found it correct. She wrote back to the Brennans with the terms and a practical note about the kitchen garden, specifically about the apple tree at the edge of the yard that needed its dead wood cleared in the spring and would repay the attention. She did not mention Thomas. She thought the Brennans probably understood without being told that the land had a history and deserved to be honored for it. The winter of 1884 was hard on the plains, the kind of hard that tested every preparation and found the gaps in it, and the Ford ranch came through it better than most because Delia had spent the autumn preparing for it with methodical thoroughness. But it was a difficult season, and everyone on the ranch felt it. The men were sometimes short-tempered and always tired, and she kept the kitchen warm and the coffee strong and the food as good as she could make it on the winter provisions, and she made no complaints about any of it. One February morning, when the temperature was vicious and the wind was cutting across the plains like something personal, she was up before dawn getting the stove going, and Harvey came in from checking the horses with his coat white with snow and his face reddened with cold. He stood by the stove and warmed his hands and looked at her in the lamp light. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I know the last year and a half has not been easy," he said. "The baby, the winter, the work of everything. I know you carry a great deal." "I carry what needs carrying," she said. "That is my nature, as you have observed." "I know," he said. "I am not saying it is too much for you. I am saying I see it, and I want you to know that I see it." She stood with the coffee pot in her hand and looked at him in the cold lamplight of a February morning, this man who had been her employer and her creditor and her partner and her husband, and who was, she knew with complete certainty, the person she was going to spend her life with. This good, steady, honest man who saw her. "I know you do," she said softly. "I have always known you do." She put the coffee on and he sat down at the table, and the baby was stirring in the back room, and the ranch was waking up around them, and the wind was doing its brutal January work outside, and none of it mattered particularly, because the kitchen was warm and he was here, and she was here, and they were, by every honest measure, all right. Thomas Harvey Ford grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's relentless practicality, which Harvey said made him either a very capable person or an extremely exhausting one to parent, and which Delia said were the same thing. He was sturdy and curious, and spent most of his time either in the kitchen garden with Delia or at the corral with Harvey, or following Pete Garvey around the ranch, with the expression of a small person conducting a thorough investigation of a large subject. Pete Garvey, for his part, behaved as though this was the role he had been born to fill. He taught the boy the names of the horses and the difference between good grass and poor grass, and how to read the sky for weather. And he told him stories about the early days of the ranch with Thomas Harvey on his knee, and the boy's dark eyes wide and attentive. And Delia watched this from the kitchen window sometimes, and felt something that was uncomplicated and generous and warm. In the spring of 1886, a second child arrived, a girl this time, whom they named Clara after Harvey's mother, and who arrived in the world with an opinion about it that she expressed immediately and continuously. She was dark-eyed like both her parents and had, by the age of 3 months, already demonstrated the kind of personality that suggested she was going to manage everyone around her with great efficiency for the rest of her life. Thomas regarded his new sister with the solemn assessment of a 3-year-old, and then announced that she was too loud, which Delia thought was fair and Harvey thought was hilarious. The ranch prospered. The wheat operation expanded in the North Fields, and Delia's careful accounting and forward planning bore out over the years in the straightforward way that careful plans usually do when executed by people who are actually willing to execute them. They hired 2 more hands, bringing the total to 8, and the bunkhouse got an addition in the summer of 1886 that Pete Garvey supervised with the imperious confidence of a man who had been wanting to add onto that bunkhouse for 10 years. Carson had moved his growing family to his own small ranch east of Caldwell by that time, but he rode over most Sundays with his wife and their 2 children, and Delia set the large table for Sunday dinner with the comfortable familiarity of a woman who had made a kitchen into a home and intended to keep it that way. The table was loud on those Sundays, full of children and opinions and Pete Garvey's long-winded pronouncements on any subject that arose, and Harvey sat at the end of it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood that what was happening around his table was worth more than any of the number she kept in the ledger. She understood it, too. One Sunday evening in the autumn of 1887, after the Sunday dinner guests had gone, and the children were in bed and Pete Garvey had retired to the bunkhouse, she and Harvey sat on the porch in the cooling air with their coffee, the way they had sat on his porch in the early days when they were not quite together but not quite separate. Except that now they were entirely together in every sense of the word, and the sitting was companionable and warm, and had the quality of something that has been worn smooth by time. The prairie was enormous around them in the dusk, the grass moving in the evening wind, the first stars appearing in the darkening east. "I have been thinking," she said. "You are always thinking," he said. "What specifically?" "The south pasture," she said. "The fencing along the creek needs replacing before spring. If we do it now while the ground is workable, we will save the difficulty of doing it in the mud." He looked at the prairie. "All right," he said. She looked at him. She felt the familiar warmth of his presence beside her, the comfort of it, the solidity of it, the specific rightness of this person next to her in the dusk. "Harvey," she said. "Yes." "I am very happy," she said. He turned and looked at her, and the lines at the corner of his eyes shifted, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder in the cooling air of the autumn evening, and they were both quiet for a long time, which was sufficient. The south pasture fencing got done before the first hard frost, and the winter wheat went in on schedule, and Clara started walking at 10 months and immediately began trying to climb the corral fence, which she was absolutely not allowed to do, and which she continued attempting on a daily basis with cheerful determination. Thomas, with the authority of an older brother, instructed her in the theoretical finer points of fence climbing while simultaneously telling his mother he had nothing to do with it. The Brennans sent a Christmas letter from the Hurst claim every year, faithfully, describing the state of the fields and the garden and the apple tree and their growing family. Delia read these letters with the satisfaction of knowing the land was loved. She had made the right choice. She had known she had, but having it confirmed each year in the Brennans' straightforward, grateful letters was a small and reliable pleasure. Pete Garvey retired from active ranch work in the spring of 1889, officially, by which everyone meant that he continued to do whatever he pleased around the ranch, but stopped pretending to be bound by a schedule. And Harvey built him a better set of quarters attached to the bunkhouse, and told him he was staying as long as he liked. Pete received this with enormous dignity, and then immediately went and planted a vegetable garden next to his new quarters that was approximately half the size of Delia's kitchen garden, and she watched this development from the kitchen window with great private amusement, and then went out and helped him plan it properly. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and he grinned at her, and they spent the afternoon in the dirt together arguing companionably about where to put the squash. Harvey watched this from the corral and smiled to himself, which he thought no one noticed, and which Delia noticed entirely but chose not to mention. Thomas Harvey Ford started school in Caldwell in the fall of 1889, and Delia drove him in on the first morning and walked him to the schoolhouse door and stood there for a moment while he looked up at her with his father's steady dark eyes. "Will you stay?" he said. The word caught her in the chest, as it always did, as she suspected it always would, the particular catch of it, the history of it. But she knew this time what it meant and what she could say, and she said it without grief and without fear, and with a completeness that healed, small increment by small increment, everything the word had once cost her. "I will be here when school is done," she said, "and I will be here tomorrow morning to bring you back. That is what staying means." He nodded, with the serene confidence of a child who had never had reason to doubt that the people he needed would be where he needed them. She drove home through the autumn morning and came into the kitchen and put the coffee on and looked at the kitchen that was, by any honest measure, the center of the life she had built from nothing after the worst morning of her life. And she thought about the telegram on a Tuesday and the drive to the Ford ranch and the first sight of Harvey at the corral fence, and the words she had said on an October afternoon without thinking and could not take back. She did not want to take it back. She had never wanted to take it back. Harvey came in at noon and she put a plate in front of him and sat across from him, and the house was full of the small sounds of a working ranch, the horses in the corral, Pete Garvey arguing with someone in the yard about the location of a fence post, Clara's high voice somewhere in the vicinity of the tomato plants demanding things of her from a distance. He looked at her over the plate and said, "Thomas get off all right. He walked into that schoolhouse like he owned it," she said. Harvey smiled. "He gets that from you. He gets that from his father," she said. He reached across the table and she took his hand, and the autumn light came through the kitchen window and the coffee was hot and the ranch was alive around them with all its work and noise and life, and she sat in the middle of it and was, by every honest measure she had ever applied to anything, entirely and permanently and gladly here. She had stayed. He had stayed. And the word, finally, had meant exactly what she had always wanted it to mean, not a plea sent into the air and ignored by the universe, but a declaration, a choice, a door opened onto light and walked through without looking back. This was the life on the other side of the worst thing. It was imperfect and demanding and full of accounting problems and fence repairs, and flooding bottomlands and children who climbed things they were not supposed to climb. And it was, without any reservation or qualification, the life she had chosen and would choose again. Every morning she woke to the Kansas sky, enormous and blue and full of possibility above the Ford ranch, above the corn and the wheat and the kitchen garden, and the man who had seen her from the first day, and kept on seeing her, and the children who had made themselves from the raw material of everything she had survived, and the old man arguing about fence posts in the yard, and all of it, entirely and unequivocally hers.